This is a Going Back, Remembering UGA interview with Mr. Larry Dendy, conducted by Fran in the conference room of the Hudson Oil Building near the historic North Campus of the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, on June 24th, 2009. Thank you, Larry, for letting us drop in today.
Thank you, Fran. It's my pleasure, and I'm honored to be part of this series.
Well, we are honored to have you. Since the fall of 1961, when you entered the University of Georgia as a freshman, you have witnessed almost 50 years of UGA history unfold here, and you've had some interesting perspectives from which to view all those happenings. So let's just start at the beginning, at your introduction to UGA. What did the University of Georgia campus look like physically when you arrived at school in the fall of 1961?
1961, of course, the campus was much smaller. The North Campus, of course, looked pretty much like it does today. It hasn't changed a lot, except for the addition of the Dean Russ building and the law school additions, but otherwise it looked pretty much like it did then. Of course, East Campus did not exist at that time. There were agriculture fields, and the old Quonset huts where the World War II veterans lived are still up when I came here. It was mainly cow pastures and ponds over there at that time. Much of the west side of the campus was not yet developed into the high-rise dorms. So primarily the campus was North Campus, the central part of the campus, where of course there was no Tate Student Center. The Memorial Hall was the main focus there. Stegman Hall was still there at the time. Going to South Campus, the physics and chemistry buildings had just been built, but they were still relatively new at that time. And going on past there, there was not a lot beyond where the Dairy Science building is now. Rural areas. The Vet College, I think, was there at the time. There was McWhorter Hall where the athletes lived across from the Vet College, but beyond that was pretty much residential areas.
My, how things have changed, haven't they? Where did students live?
At that time, of course, all the students lived in dormitories. Certainly the freshmen did. I lived in Reed Hall as a freshman, and most of the students, which at that time we had, I think, maybe 8,000 to 9,000 students, so there were far fewer to accommodate. And most of us, I think, lived in dormitories. A good number did live off campus, upper class folks and students who were married, but primarily undergraduates lived on campus, I think.
And the women couldn't live in apartments when you got here off campus, is that right?
Not unless they were married, they couldn't.
Okay. Where did you eat, Larry?
Well, I ate in the dining hall, which was in the basement of Memorial Hall. And you used to go down there, and the line would extend way out the door, and you would stand in a line with a card that got punched and went through the line. And it seems now, looking back, that they had the same food almost every day. It was not the most memorable culinary experience that I've ever had, but it was enough to sustain us.
Times have changed. We're living in the days of the Ritz for our food services now.
Definitely now.
How did you get around?
You walked. There was no bus system, of course. No students at that time didn't have bicycles, certainly none of the little scooters that we have. You walked. It was common at that time for female students to get rides with male students who had cars, and it was common for female students to stand on the curb and wait for a friend or even a non-acquaintance to come by and offer them a ride across campus to where they needed to go. But with fewer students, there were certainly far fewer cars, and so parking was not nearly as much of a problem as it is now.
And I cannot imagine the day when parking was not a concern. That's good to know. Where did students gather on campus?
I think on campus, as I recall, Memorial Hall was the student center. And so there were some offices there for student activities, a limited number of offices for student activities, but there was a big ballroom there, which still is there. And it seems like every weekend there was a dance of some sort in Memorial Hall ballroom, and many of those dances were private, but there was a balcony up above the ballroom, and you could stand up there and listen to the music and watch folks down on the dance floor enjoying themselves. So we hung out there a lot. Memorial Hall also had some pool tables and recreational areas, and we went down there some. There wasn't a heck of a lot to do on campus at that time, recreation-wise, except for Memorial Hall that I recall.
Was there an off-campus hangout?
There were a number of off-campus hangouts, most of which I personally did not attend or get involved in, but I heard about them. But there was a bowling alley uptown, and a lot of students went to the bowling alley. There was, of course, cinema or movies. There was movies uptown, and also Beechwood Cinema, and so the students went to the movies. There were not nearly as not bars or drinking establishments as there are now. Certainly not as many. A few restaurants that the students went to, but there was not, as I recall, not nearly the kind of active social life then as students enjoy now.
I was going to ask you, I know that through the years there have always been big events that sort of have encompassed the whole campus. Early on in the 30s and 40s, it was little commencement in the spring and big homecoming due in the fall, and I think homecoming has always been with us. Big concerts, as I recall, surrounding homecoming.
There was always a big homecoming concert, and it was usually held, as I recall, in Stegman Hall, which of course was a massive gymnasium, and the acoustics there were terrible. But that's where we had concerts until the Coliseum was built, and then we moved the concerts to the Coliseum. There were some big names for that time, musicians and entertainers who came here, and students always went to those. Of course, football then, as now, was a big event, popular, and certainly the students enjoyed that activity, as well as basketball. And the other sports were not, I don't think, as popular and as well attended as they are now. We didn't have gymnastics, for example. I don't think the swimming team and the golf team and the tennis team were as successful then as they are now, so not as many students attended, but football and basketball were certainly big attractions then.
Big deal. What did you do on a date?
You went to a movie, went to a restaurant. If there was a dance on campus, and there were often open dances, that is, dances that either fraternities or student organizations had. They were open dances, and you could go to those. But primarily, I think things like going for a movie, for dinner, out to Memorial Park to enjoy the lake, those sorts of things were pretty common.
And get your date home by what time? Because they were signed in and signed out.
I think, as I recall, the women students had to be in by 11 o'clock. And apparently, I was always told there was a house mother at the door clocking them in, and if they came in a minute after 11, they were in hot water.
Maybe we better move on to the academic side of things. Larry, you were a journalism major, and what led you in that direction? Why journalism?
In high school, I decided I wanted to be the world's next great reporter, and at that time, and still now, the University of Georgia Journalism School was certainly the best journalism education in Georgia, and today certainly one of the finest in the country. And so I determined early on that I wanted to go to the Grady College of Journalism, as it was then known, Henry Grady College of Journalism, School of Journalism, I think it was actually then, and that I wanted to graduate and be the world's next great journalist.
Living the dream. What faculty were memorable to you or influenced you while you were and you would have had classes in throughout arts and sciences also. What special faculty that you?
Well, certainly the faculty that's most memorable to me would be the journalism faculty.
Right.
And at the top of that list, of course, is the legendary Dean Drury, who was still very much active and involved in running the journalism school at that time. He was a legend, and certainly someone that infected me and hundreds, if not thousands, of students before and after me. I remember folks like George Abney, Charles Kopp, Dan Kitchens was the advisor to the Red and Black and was someone who taught us a great deal about the realities of journalism. Those folks were there.
And at that time, the Red and Black, our student newspaper, was a part of the journalism school. Is that correct?
It was considered actually a laboratory course for the journalism college. You got, I think, one credit, an hour's credit, for working each quarter on the Red and Black. And it was located, of course, in the basement of what was then called the CJ building, Commerce Journalism Building. And
which is today Brooks Hall.
Which is today Brooks Hall. The Red and Black offices were down in the basement, and the journalism school was responsible for the oversight of the Red and Black. And Dan Kitchens was the advisor to the Red and Black, and that was part of his faculty duties, was to guide us in our work on the Red and Black.
That's changed a little bit these days, hasn't it?
Right now, of course, the Red and Black has no official affiliation with the university, and certainly no kind of oversight or direction from the university in any sense.
Independent organ. Well, the 60s were a time of tumultuous change in our country and certainly on college campuses, and you were here to see through the eyes of a student many of those happenings, but also, as you've mentioned, through the eyes of a reporter, because you worked on the Red and Black, I guess your whole tenure here at school, and eventually were editor of the Red and Black in 1965. The university had been desegregated in January of 1961, and you entered that fall. What was the campus climate like at that time? The nation was dealing with civil rights issues and continuing to do that. How did that translate to life on campus?
I can't really remember that there was much impact. Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes were students here, and Charlene was a journalism student, actually. I never knew her personally as a student, though I occasionally would see her in the journalism college, her journalism school. I never had any interaction with Hamilton at all, and my impression was that they pretty much were ignored and let alone. There were I recall some unpleasant incidents in the football stadium when they came into the stadium, which were unfortunate and regrettable, but they happened. But there was nothing in the way of any serious trouble that I recall. And of course, after Hamilton and Charlene, more African American students enrolled, and it became more and more commonplace. But by the time I left, or by the time I graduated in 1965, I think there were still only a handful of African American students here. But I think at that time that clearly they were accepted and regarded as just other students.
Okay. Also in 1961, an historical presidential campaign was being waged. Of course, the Kennedy-Nixon campaign. Was the campus caught up in any way in that race, or was apathy abounding, or do you remember that as being something that our campus had some kind of fervor for?
Well, actually, as I recall, Kennedy was elected in '60.
Oh,
so
I'm sorry.
I think
you're right.
So he was president when I entered. What happened when I entered in '63, of course, was that he was assassinated.
Right.
And that cast a great pall over the campus, as it did over the nation. And there was a number of memorials and activities in memory of him and in honor of him. The presidential election that I remember most vividly was the 1964 presidential election between Barry Goldwater and Lyndon Johnson. And I personally remember that because I was editor of the Red and Black in the fall quarter of 1964 when that election was occurring. And I took it upon myself to editorialize on behalf of Lyndon Johnson, and in fact to endorse Lyndon Johnson as editor of the Red and Black. And my endorsement and my strong support of Lyndon Johnson got me in considerable hot water that fall through some imprudent language and intemperate verbiage that I used to describe his opponent, and some things that I wrote in the Red and Black that were at that time and now immature and amateurish, but at that time seemed to be perfectly reasonable. But the campus, needless to say, did not go along with my views, and there was a straw poll held in which Goldwater defeated Johnson heavily. And of course, in the real election, Georgia went heavily for Goldwater. So my views and my support of Johnson were certainly in the minority.
Those are the ones that we remember sometimes. The ones that come back and get us, right? Well, going back, and you're exactly right. Don't know what I was thinking about about 1961, but was going to say that for you, on a personal note, the fact that John Kennedy was elected affected your life later. Do you want to talk about that briefly?
Well, it certainly affected my life in one way. Well, it affected my life in a number of ways, but one way in particular, in that John Kennedy started the Peace Corps.
Exactly.
And when I graduated in June of 1965, my wife, Gail, and I immediately went into the Peace Corps after my graduation and served 2 years in India in the Peace Corps, which was certainly a memorable experience and one that I'll always be grateful for.
Okay. Talk a little bit about local campus politics. Was there a time when the Student Government Association's races seemed to have some meaning, and there was there were organizations who worked hard? And
at the time I was in school, there was still a very distinct split, I guess, between the independents and the Greeks, and that was the political flavor of the campus also. There was actually a women's student government organization as well as a university student government organization, and there were elections each year for the president of the student body. And those elections generally were between a Greek candidate and an independent candidate. And of course, then as now, the student body was more independent than Greek, but often the Greek candidate was able to win by virtue of getting out the most votes.
Mm-hmm.
But there were some other influences in campus politics at that time. Certainly one of them was the Demosthenian Literary Society. And a lot of the members of that group, which at the time was all male, were very influential in working for candidates for campus office. And they tended to be more independent, I think, but they were certainly a factor in some of the elections that were held.
What would a typical red and black issue look like in the early 1960s?
The Red and Black at that time was what we called a tabloid format, which was about half the size of a regular newspaper. It came out weekly, and although when I was editor or when I was on the staff, we actually moved it to twice weekly. But it was just a cut above a high school newspaper, I think. Although we prided ourselves on being journalists, we really were pretty amateurish, not anything like the quality of the students who write for the Red and Black today. We had some pretty silly fluff in the paper, like the weekly Girl of the Week, where we found a pretty girl and put her in some short shorts and took her picture. And then we topped that off by having the Girl of the Quarter, selected from all the girls of the week. We had a society page, the highlight of which was the weekly listing of girls who had either been pinned or lavaliered or actually engaged, and then also the weekly scoop of who was seen dating who. We had a one page, sometimes quarter sports page, so not nearly anything like the in-depth coverage of sports we have today. We rarely ever questioned the authority of the university administration in any way. We reported what we were told to report, and did very little in the way of enterprising our own stories. It was a good experience and a good learning experience for us, but it was certainly not the quality of journalism that our students enjoy today, I don't think, or practice today.
You mentioned the Goldwater Johnson piece. Was there another piece that sticks in your mind as the most significant that you penned while you were working on the paper?
I had an opportunity before I became the editor to write a series of columns, personal columns, that ran, I think it was in the spring or winter quarter before I became editor, and that just gave me an opportunity to just write about anything I wanted to. And some of those were very personal columns for me, some ways that I was trying to express some of my experiences and feelings here, and some of those I remember. But as editor, I also had a personal column in addition to doing the staff editorial. And some of those columns that I wrote as editor were what really got me in hot water as far as my political views at the time.
What was the biggest student gripe on campus at that time?
I guess it depended on whether you were a man or a woman, but certainly the women did not like the rules that they lived under. They didn't like the restrictions on their time. They didn't like the silly rule about having to wear raincoats when you were going to physical education in your shorts. You couldn't smoke on campus, or women could not smoke on campus. There were rules about not dress exactly, but there were understood rules about how you would appear on campus. Certainly there were no nose rings and tattoos and pink hair like we see today. But I think that, in general, it was just a different time and a quieter, less volatile time than it is now.
And loco parentis certainly was in place at the University of Georgia.
Loco parentis was in place. I personally was never flagged by Dean Tate, but the rumors and the stories were that he would not hesitate to call down anyone who violated what he considered to be inappropriate or performed inappropriate actions.
In 1963, we got a new football coach.
Yep.
Vince Dooley came to town. Do you remember how his arrival affected life on campus?
I remember he succeeded Johnny Griffith, who unfortunately did not have a very successful tenure. And I remember that the hopes were very high for Vince Dooley, but the expectations were fairly low because he was not a known entity, did not have a strong record to come to, and there was some, I guess, concern about the choice at the time. As it turned out, of course, it was a wonderful choice. But at the time, I think there were people who were not really convinced. But after his first season, which was
pretty quickly, they were
great success,
yeah.
I think he showed folks that he was the real deal.
After graduation, then you joined the Peace Corps, and you all were in India for 2 years. And then you came back, and you went to work for some newspapers, Winston-Salem.
Worked for 3 years at the Winston-Salem Journal as a reporter. And then we had a child and a son, and both sets of grandparents pretty much laid down the law that we needed to get back to Georgia. And plus, we wanted to come back. And so we moved to Tifton, Georgia. And I worked there on the Tifton newspaper as an editor for about a year and a half. And then we moved to Athens in 1972, primarily so my wife, Gail, could go back to school. She had dropped out of school when we got married, and so she wanted to finish her degree, and she did ultimately get her undergraduate and her master's in history here.
How did the coming back to Athens work out? You came back and you came to work for public affairs, is that right?
I was very fortunate to find a job in public affairs. At that time we called it the Public Relations Office. The director of the office was Barry Wood, who had been a classmate of mine in the journalism school. So I knew Barry from a long time back. And he had an opening for a writer who would do primarily science news. I had no science background, had never taken anything beyond geometry or geology 101, and never took a math course in college, which is not anything to boast about, but I never had a math course, never had any advanced science courses. Nevertheless, I convinced Barry by telling him that I thought everybody had a story to tell, and all it took was somebody to be able to get that story, and he bought that line, and so let me start working as a science writer and also editor of the magazine that we then called the Research Reporter, and that was how I started here. I held that job for I guess 9 or 10 months, and then the news director in the office left, and I applied and was chosen to become the news director for the Public Relations Office. And I held that job for more than 15 years, I think.
And right where the action was, or where you could see the action, right?
Yeah. The Public Relations Office has always been a place where you kind of were on the inside and knew what was going on. Not necessarily that we affected the decisions, but we were certainly involved in the decisions and informed about the decisions. And it's been a very, very interesting opportunity to sort of know the behind-the-scenes workings of decisions and actions and policies and the way that the university works.
I was going to say, so from 1972 until present day, that's several years, Larry. That's 37 years?
It'll be 37 years if you count them all.
You have seen 37 years worth of goings on at the University of Georgia, and you and I had talked earlier about some of the things that stand out in your mind. And one of those that you mentioned was the streaking. Talk about streaking.
Well, I think anyone who was around in 1975, I guess it was, would remember that just because it was so unusual. It was just a phenomenon of the time. It lasted, it seems like now, 2 or 3 months. Happened in the spring of that year. It was an unusually warm spring, and this started popping up in other schools and quickly just spread to all the schools around the country and came here. And
our competitive nature made us get involved. That's what it was.
That's what it was. I, of course, was covering it in my official capacity as the university's public relations person, so I had a professional interest in this matter.
Of course.
And so I, was required to go out and view it and be knowledgeable about it. But I was present for the great streak of, I forget exactly which night it was, but I was present when at least 1,500 to 1,700 students ran across the Stanford Stadium Bridge onto the Reed Quad and had a big party, and I think we claim to have set the streaking record that night, and I don't know that anyone has ever challenged us on that. It was an odd and bemusing kind of event because there was really nothing that could be done to stop it once it got started. It just had to run its course. But we had some really funny incidents as a result of the streaking.
That was an interesting time. What other things, Larry, come to mind as you think back over nearly 40 years, consecutive years here at the university?
Well, certainly some of the football highlights, certainly the Herschel Walker era, I enjoyed that, and the national championship. One of the real highlights for me was the celebration of the university's bicentennial in 1984, 1985. It was actually a 16-month event recognizing the creation and the founding of the first state university in America, the University of Georgia. And it was our 200th anniversary in 1985, but we began in 1984 with a celebration that included just hundreds and hundreds of activities over the years, over the 16 months. We had a wonderful opening convocation highlighted by a speech from then Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush, who came. We had lectures by Nobel Prize winners and Pulitzer Prize winners. We had visits from former presidents Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. We commissioned a symphonic piece for celebrating the bicentennial. Found this little patch that we had for the bicentennial. We created a special medal, bicentennial medal, that was presented to some of our outstanding faculty members, Lamar Dodd, Dean Russ, Gene Odom, Glenn Burton. We had a fundraising, the first major fundraising effort that the university had undertaken in many years that resulted in, I think, eventually more than $90 million through the Bicentennial Fund. It was a great time for celebrating the creation of the university and what it meant, not only to Georgia, but the fact that this university really was marked the beginning of the system of public higher education in America that now includes more than 3,000 state sponsored colleges and universities. So we claim, and rightly are, not only the birthplace of higher education in Georgia, but the birthplace of public higher education in the United States. And that was the message we were really trying to get out for the bicentennial. We had many events to do that, and I think if you look at the huge collection of publicity and materials that emanated from the bicentennial, I think we were successful in showing that.
It was a fine time. You mentioned Herschel, other well-known individuals, and you had an opportunity to interview a number of those folks, but I recall that Deborah Norville stands out in your mind as special.
I actually knew Deborah when she was a student here. She was active in the organization at that time called Sigma Delta Chi, which was the professional journalism organization, and I got to know Deborah that way. And after she left here, she went on, of course, to have a very successful career and as a television journalist, and eventually became the anchor of the Today Show on NBC. And in that capacity, I had the opportunity to interview her. This was after I had actually left my position as news director and was working as the assistant to Tom Jackson, who was in the director of our office. In that role, or in that position, I wrote a number of articles for the Alumni magazine and some other magazines. And so I interviewed Deborah and wrote a story about her that was to appear in the University Alumni magazine, the Alumni Record. I don't recall exactly how it happened, but the Saturday Evening Post also wanted to do a story about Deborah, and they contacted our office just for some basic information. And I sent them a copy of my story about Deborah just for their background information. Well, they turned it into their cover story of their magazine.
Wow.
Which came out before our story appeared in the alumni record. So it was a great opportunity for the university to have some good exposure through the Saturday Evening Post, and of course I was very proud, but we were a little startled to see our story appear there before we had it in our own magazine.
Other things that you remember over the years. Talk a little bit about the Jan Kemp affair.
I was not directly involved in the Jan Kemp affair in the sense that I didn't have any personal involvement in it. My involvement was as the news director at the time, and of course it created a brought national attention to the university, both through the newspapers and through radio and television coverage. We had a clipping service at that time, and one of my duties was to monitor the clipping service, and we just had literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of clippings from all over the country as the Kemp trial was going on, the reporting from that. And it was extremely discouraging to me and to those of us in the office that the University of Georgia was getting this kind of negative attention when there was so much positive that we had to talk about and so much good that was happening here. We just finished the bicentennial, a great celebration of the university's contribution to higher education in America, and we just come off that real high, and then to fall into this terrible depression of bad publicity and negative attention was very deflating to us. But our office had the responsibility to monitor the trial, and we had folks from our office who actually went and sat in on the trial. And to the extent we could, we tried to answer questions from the press, but of course we had a limited role in that. We couldn't comment on legal actions. Our office was involved in helping President Davison at that time with his responses to the trial and to the other matters that came up. So our office was involved, and I was involved to the extent that I was in the office. But I'll always be regretful that I think that the ultimate outcome of the Kemp episode was positive in the sense of improving academic expectations for our athletes. That was positive. But I'll always be regretful about the negative image of the University of Georgia that arose out of that.
And right after that, one of the end results of that was our then president, Dr. Davison, left, resigned, and at that point, Dr. Henry King Stanford arrived.
Stanford came. Dr. Stanford was, as I say, a breath of fresh air for us. He was upbeat, positive, ebullient, joyful, happy, just what we needed at that time, I think. The campus was in a very depressed mood, and we needed some good positive vibes, and Dr. King brought that, and Dr. Stanford brought that. He, as he said, carried the message from Athens to Rome and parts in between, talking about what a great place the University of Georgia was. And he really turned things around, both internally on the campus as well as the perception in the state of the university, I think. He was he was the right man at the right time for us.
He worked well with a public affairs office.
Oh,
was he a person who understood?
Oh, yeah. One of his first decisions, I think, was to change our name from public relations to public information. He told, at that time, Tom Landrum was the director, I think, and he walked in one day and said, "You're now public information." But he was very, very accessible, his whole time here was essentially a public relations gig, and he brought the best to it.
And from our conversation with him in our interview, he had a ball too.
Oh, I think he did. I think he had a ball wherever he went and whatever he did, but he thoroughly enjoyed his time here, I think.
I think that's true. That's true. And that was followed by Dr. Charles Knapp's tenure here.
Yeah. I had the opportunity to do one of the first interviews with Dr. Knapp, and it was very clear that he was a different kind of personality and had a different approach than Dr. Davison and then Dr. Stanford. But he was certainly a man of vision and certainly a man who brought great advances to the university, particularly, of course. I think he'll always be remembered. He'll be remembered for many things, but particularly he'll be remembered as the person who gave birth to East Campus, and his vision for the performing arts facilities there, for the Ramsey Center, for that whole complex was really something that, frankly, I don't think most of us thought could happen when he came here and told us that was what he wanted to do. But he brought it to pass, and it's certainly been a wonderful addition to the campus.
Absolutely. 1996, actually long before that, we knew that the Summer Olympics were going to be, we were going to be hosting some of those events and lots of those folks on our campus.
Right. Dr. Knapp, I think, was certainly involved early on in promoting the University of Georgia as a site for some Olympic competition. Initially, we were trying to get the tennis competition, and we held a big event over at the tennis, over on intramural fields to try to persuade the Olympics folks to bring the tennis venue here. That didn't work. But subsequently, of course, we were chosen for soccer and rhythmic gymnastics and the third competition.
Volleyball.
Volleyball, thank you. And the Olympics were, I guess, obviously the once in a lifetime kind of thing to say that you were involved in. Our office, the public, at that time, I think we had become University Communications Office, maybe. We changed our name several times. But University Communications, or Public Information, was heavily involved in the planning and the carrying out of many of the activities involved in the Olympics, which brought, of course, thousands of people to Athens and gave the University of Georgia tremendous exposure through the coverage of those events and through the visitors who came here. You'll remember that we put up visitors' booths around campus and staffed those, that we did in a number of publications and other kinds of promotional activities. One of the great legacies of the Olympics actually was the visitor center. We didn't have a visitor center until we anticipated all the influx of folks coming for the Olympics, and we decided that we needed to have such a center, not only for the Olympics, but that was certainly the impetus for it. And of course, I remember Tom Jackson and I going over to what was in a chicken house and wading through the cobwebs and the chicken litter and trying to envision what it would look like. And I actually wrote the first proposal for the visitor center and tried to envision what it would do and how it would work.
And some of us are glad you did that.
But it has turned out to be an enormous benefit to the university, and that was one of the many values of the Olympics was getting the visitor center open.
Life is rich and full at the university, and it continues to go on. Are there other events or experiences or individuals that stand out to you that we ought to save in our media archives that you can talk about?
Well, certainly after President Neff left, the arrival of President Adams has brought a whole new set of opportunities and experiences to us, and he's also been a great asset to the university. I think the thrust that he and former Provost Holbrook developed in terms of expanding our research into the medical area and building our strength in medicine, biomedicine, has certainly been visionary, and will lead to great benefits for the university and for the state. And that's certainly a tribute to Dr. Adams and Dr. Holbrook and their vision for what this university should be and could be. There have been, many characters over the years, certainly that I've had the opportunity to work with. Dean Tate, knew him when he was Dean of Men, and later as when he worked for the Alumni Association, and valued that experience. I knew Dr. McBee, Louise McBee, when I was a student, and still consider her today one of my dear friends. So that association has been great over the years. Folks like Lamar Dodd and Albert Say in the political science department, some of those folks who were here just for years and years and years, and whose presence created a legacy that we all enjoy today. It was an opportunity to know them and be part of their experiences here, and I'm very grateful for that too.
Well, Larry, the University of Georgia has been a part of your life, a significant part of your life. Talk to us a little bit, as I recall, you met your wife at the university. Talk to us a little bit about Gail and your family.
When I came here as a freshman, I began attending a church here, West End Baptist Church, and also attending that church was a family that I got to know, and they had a daughter named Gail, who's Carter family. Mr. Carter, Silas Carter, actually worked for 40 years for the university in what was in the College of Agriculture as manager of the farm and as a worker on the farm. Anyway, they attended the church, and I got to know them and got to know Gail, and eventually Gail and I paired up and got married, and have been married now for going on 44 years, I guess. But Gail has experienced all the things that I've experienced over the years by virtue of having to live with me and endure and put up with all that I've done. But one of the things that both she and I are very proud of is that we used to go to a lot of events where the alma mater was sung. And the alma mater was written, I think, in 1912, at which time there were no female students at the university. Females were not enrolled or admitted until 1918. So the alma mater did not reflect the presence of women at the university, and that always just really irritated Gail. And she, in fact, became so irritated she refused to sing the alma mater. So one time I said, well, if you don't like it, why don't you just do something about it? And she said, okay, I will. So she wrote a verse that was added to the alma mater in, I think, around 1990, and it's the third verse that reflects the presence of women at the University of Georgia. And it starts, and thy daughters proudly join thee, and goes on to say, equal dreams embrace. And it reflects the presence of women at the university. And she has, over the years, just been thanked many, many times, particularly by women who shared her displeasure at the fact that women were not recognized in the alma mater, and that she was able to bring that about. So that's something we're both very proud of.
She'll be remembered forever.
I hope so.
Yeah. That's right. And you have a son?
We have a son who grew up here, of course, and graduated from Cedar Shoals High School, and who we fervently hoped would attend the University of Georgia, and who in fact did attend the University of Georgia for his freshman year, played in the Redcoat Band, actually. His name is Christopher. But like many children who grow up in Athens, he wanted to get away, and so he transferred after his freshman year here, and he eventually graduated from the University of Chicago, and then got a master's degree at Indiana University. But he still considers Athens his home, and still loves to come back, and still loves to go to Georgia football games. So he has a strong attachment to Athens, even though he's not here.
And a grandbaby or two.
Got 2 grandchildren. One is our grandson is Park Street Dendy, who is now will be 6 in August and starting 1st grade. And our granddaughter is Carter Dendy, my wife's maiden name, first name. And she was 4 and is in kindergarten. So we are happy grandparents.
That's wonderful. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I'm just honored to be included in a series of interviews that includes such outstanding people. And thank you for doing this.
Well, we were honored that you would be with us today, and we want to congratulate you on your impending retirement in the next, how many days now?
I think it's 5 days, but who's counting?
Congratulations, but thank you, Larry.
Thank you.